program enables women to check out career opportunities closed to them in the past. Opportunities for women on income assistance, often single parents, to find productive, significant jobs. Opportunities for women to break into non-traditional fields. And why not?
Well, it's fair to say that our future growth depends to a great extent on the women of British Columbia. Our future's in resource development. And the women of British Columbia are out there working now, helping to develop our economic recovery.
While recession is a reality we all face, BC is planning and working now for recovery.
BCTV.
Good morning. Today we're going to deal with jobs, lack of jobs, UIC, lack of UIC, EBAP programs, need programs, immigration scams. We're told in the Auditor General's report that the headquarters of the Immigration Department doesn't know what's happening in the rest of the department concerning illegal aliens and other matters. And in the studio this morning is Lloyd Axworthy, the Minister of, not Manpower, Employment and Immigration. And during the course of my interview with Mr. Axworthy, I plan to ask him about a family in which many people are interested, the potential German immigrant family, the Eisenbergs, who are now due to leave the country on December the 7th. And as if by happy coincidence this morning, who is here? None other than the man who, in fact, say I, created BC's Labour Code. Some hate it, some love it, most think it's pretty good. Now, from Harvard Law School, the Paul Weiler. And a memo, by the way, just to Jack Monroe and Blanchard of the IWA. Remember the shingle mills we were talking about that were closed down last week? 150 men losing jobs at about $3,000 to $4,000 a month. The name of Peter Best was mentioned in that program, and Peter Best of Bestwood Products is here to correct what he says are errors of statements made by Monroe and Blanchard. But first off the top, the Minister of Employment and Immigration, the Lloyd Axworthy. Before I turn to what the Auditor General describes as wholesale scams and rackets and illegal immigration networks, Mr. Axworthy, I'd like you to give me the positive news of what jobs or what new jobs you plan to create as we face a pretty disastrous winter with anything in various towns from 12 to 20% unemployment in BC.
Well, I guess the best news I can bring this morning is we'll be signing an agreement with the BC government, $65 million of job creation money for the province, designed particularly to help those who have exhausted their employment benefits, their unemployment insurance benefits. So these will be jobs that particularly can be sponsored by the private sector to modernize equipment, help develop more productive enterprises, jobs sponsored by municipalities, by community organizations, and by the provincial and federal governments.
Is this $65 million purely for labor costs?
No, there's a portion that can be applied for capital and administration, about 25%, so that we're trying to provide an incentive, and the key to it, and we're having some success across the country, is to not do this just by ourselves, but to work in partnership with the provinces, with the private sector, with labor, to see if we can develop a pretty total approach to the problem. And
okay, 65 million. How many jobs will that translate to?
We estimate about 8,000 jobs.
When, if I may ask quite bluntly, when? How long will it take to get the bureaucrats and the paperwork into action?
Well, in fact, with the signing of the agreement this morning, we'll also be announcing the first actual job project, which we're signing an agreement with the IWA up in Terrace to get 80 people back to work, and they'll start right away.
In a mill or reforestation?
A free reforestation project.
Reforestation. Now,
Yeah.
this is not this kind of Mickey Mouse EBAP thing, is it?
No, this is a direct grant from the federal government combined with with provincial money.
Who will get these jobs? Only union members?
Oh no, the program is designed to provide jobs for those who've exhausted benefits, whether they are union or non-union members. But each project will sort of, put down its own specifications. They may need different kinds of skills, so people would apply through our employment centers.
They won't be hired by the unions, for instance.
No,
they'll be hired by anybody. EBAP was only for people still on UIC.
That's right.
Exhaustees couldn't get the job.
Right.
There are 70,000 exhaustees in BC. Is this aimed at the exhaustees or anyone who can get in?
Well, they're aimed primarily at those who've exhausted benefits, but it is important to point out that a lot of people who've exhausted benefits also find work. About 30–40% find another job within maybe 7 or 8 weeks. This is designed to help those who are hardest hit, those who perhaps find the only solution is to go on social welfare.
Right, and these will be short-term jobs, 13-week jobs?
They can go anywhere from 12 weeks to 12 months. They can last a whole year.
So on these jobs, people will be able normally to qualify for renewed unemployment insurance?
That's possible, but what we hope and are trying to achieve is that the jobs themselves will be of a pretty constructive nature, that we just won't be painting goalposts or fence posts. We'll be doing something that will provide an additional, real productive element to the community.
Mr. Axworthy, you're the cabinet minister from the West. Do these prosperous people in Ottawa, where real estate prices go up and where nobody's ever out of work, do they know what's happening in the rest of the country? We sometimes wonder.
Well, some of us know. Some of us spend a lot of time traveling across the country talking to those who are deeply affected, and I think we very obviously see that the priority of the government coming up in this next several months is to try to get the economy stimulated, and through our job programs to help those who are most severely affected by the recession.
So this is your big push. 8,000 jobs for British Columbia under this NEED program.
Yeah, and just to put it in context, we hope that we'd be able to provide jobs for about 100,000 people across the country. Now there are many other job creation programs in the works, so I guess in this year we would be providing direct support for about 200,000 Canadians in our direct employment programs.
Well, one way you've been able to do it, of course, is by doubling the UI premiums. That gave you some money for it, because you haven't created any new money, have you?
Well, we didn't get the money from that. We got, and by the way, the increase was only 30%.
Oh,
35%.
I'm sorry, it wasn't doubled.
Just want to be accurate.
Just 30%. What's the deficit in UI for those who worry about deficits? Although, what's 24 billion among friends?
Well, the deficit is pretty severe, and that's one reason why we had to raise the premiums, to provide for some balance so we wouldn't have the fund go into a very deep hole. It would be perhaps between $8 or $9 billion this year, but that's an estimate. We wouldn't have the full calculations for a while.
Is your cabinet really well informed on the fact that if the United States brings in an arbitrary countervailing duty on March the 7th, that it could bankrupt the BC lumber industry?
I think there's a great deal of concern in Ottawa.
See, we sometimes feel that, you know, we are in a different country.
But you're not. I think the concerns in British Columbia are very well represented. We have a couple of good ministers from here who make the message very clear.
I just can't remember them getting elected, that's all. Oh, you're talking about Mrs. Perot and Austin, of course.
We're working on that,
Let's come to immigration, sir.
Okay.
I was, you know, I've been around a long while, and I'm nearly double your age. I was appalled to read the Auditor General of Canada's report to the House of Commons. I had no idea that your immigration department was in such a state of disarray. How has it come to be like this, sir? And just little background, one little piece of paper. We have wholesale illegal immigration networks. We have family reunification scams, many of whose so-called immigrants can't adapt. Severe repercussions on our social service scheme. People coming in with pregnancies, engagements, weddings of convenience, false documents, dubious family ties, a wonderful racket called the courier parent racket, sponsorship rackets. Nobody knows who's gone on to welfare despite sponsorship. $10 million in vanished loans. The great new thing in April 1978, when you changed the age of parents to those below 60, which has created an exploding chain of family relationships. do you know about this, sir?
Well, let me explain. I don't think that chartered accountants are necessarily the best people to comment on an immigration program. And with all due deference to the Auditor General, who's a very distinguished man, I don't think he fully, or his department fully understood what we try to do in immigration. And therefore, I think he doesn't really develop the kinds of policies or programs are necessary to make the program work, as Parliament stated it.
Is the program full of loopholes or not, sir?
There are some.
Many of them.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say many of them. I think that what we're trying to do in immigration, and you always have to do this, Jack, is you have to bring a human quality in. You can't have a bunch of rigid rules in which some machine or computer can adjust or judge on. You're dealing with human cases. You're dealing with a wide variety of individuals, many of whom are desperate to leave an impoverished situation to come to Canada. And you have to make discretion. So the Auditor General, for example, criticizes the use of ministerial permits, which is a way of saying that you can land somebody in this country for a period of time without going through the normal procedures. Well, let me give you an example. I was in Central America a few weeks back dealing with refugees. Now, I instructed our immigration officers there that if they ran into a case where someone was threatened with torture or imprisonment, to use a ministerial permit to bring them out and bring them to Canada, and we'd process them here in Canada.
Perfectly all right.
Now, the Auditor General would say we shouldn't be doing that because he's dealing in statistics. He's not dealing in human quality. He's not dealing in human need and suffering. And that's what I'm dealing with. Now let me finish this, Jack. I'm not saying that there aren't some legitimate criticisms. And I would point out that we've just established an independent task force headed by Jerry Robinson, who in fact is a lawyer here in British Columbia, to examine the whole enforcement area, to try to bring recommendations, which I hope to act on this spring, to plug the loopholes, to get rid of some of the openings which people can abuse. So I'm not saying that we should ignore them, but I'm not saying it's nearly as drastic or as dire as the Auditor General points out.
He says it's, I mean, I've had stories for years, and this is the first time I've ever seen it in black and white, widespread illegal immigration scams of the highest order. That's what he says.
Well, I don't think...
Is that not true?
There are people who abuse the system. There's no question about that.
Thousands of them who abuse the system.
He doesn't know, and we don't know either.
Because you couldn't tell him.
Well, he doesn't know either.
He said that your intelligence people don't know that your people at the borders don't use your up-to-date equipment, your computer, to check for illegal aliens. He says that. And this is known as the easiest country in the world into which to come illegally.
You know, I think that some of those comments really are demonstrate a profound lack of understanding of immigration policy, because I would point out that every other country that I've talked to, and I meet a lot with other immigration officials, face the same problem. You set up a certain set of rules. Human nature is such that people will try to get around them. I don't think we're any better, and certainly no worse in many other countries. Put yourself in the position of the U.S. government, which is dealing with hundreds of thousands of illegals every year. We don't have that problem in Canada.
Webster and the Minister of Employment and Immigration, more on this particular topic after the break. Question to Mr. Axworthy, who will concede that there are a few little things wrong with immigration, but that the Auditor General doesn't know his elbow from a hole in the ground. Is that correct?
I didn't say that. I said I think that a lot of those problems were highly dramatized.
Okay, simple question.
Okay.
How many illegal immigrants, sir, Mr. Minister, are there in Canada today?
No one knows.
Is the figure widely used $200,000, 200,000 more or less?
That was a figure put forward by my advisory council, but in talking to them, I asked where the figures come from. It's a guess. No one knows for sure.
That's right, because you've lost track of many immigrants, of course.
In fact, what we would say is that the numbers are substantially less than that. If you go by the previous experience, and you said you've been around a long time.
Yes.
I take your word for that.
Thank you.
You'll remember we did an amnesty in the middle of the 1970s.
That was for the Americans and others.
Well, people predicted there'd be about 200,000 applying at that time. We got 30,000.
And the one before that, sir, do you remember it?
Again, much fewer than anyone predicted.
No, it was 12,000 and came to 12,000.
Yeah. So what it really is I think that people, like a lot of things, tend to fantasize and exaggerate the problems, and when you get down to the hard, cold reality, they're far less than they really are.
Is it a fact that your advisory committee has recommended a 6-year amnesty for all those in Canada before July the 1st, 1982, and they should come forward voluntarily? Your
Yes.
committee has recommended that.
Recommended that.
You're prepared to accept that?
No, I'm right now have asked for an independent appraisal and consultation on it before I take any action on it. And in fact, what I instructed Mr. Robinson to do was to look at the second part of the recommendations, which was the enforcement side, because you don't go around making amnesties until you're sure that you've got better controls. And so that we're looking at the control side, but I want to make it clear that at the present time I have no intention of providing any amnesty.
No intention.
Not at this point in time.
What is the percentage of total immigrants over the last year or the last 4 years who have been landed and regularized from within the country by ministerial permit?
Well, the Auditor General estimate's about 10%.
That means 10%, that means 50,000
No,
over the last 4 years.
if you're taking each year, but the numbers go up and down. I mean, this year we're only dealing with about 120,000 people coming in.
All right, let's look at how the immigration racket works, or rather the immigration looseness works. I am an immigrant from country A. I come in with my wife, myself, and my 4 children, correct?
Right.
And I don't need to be able to speak the language of the country, do I?
No?
And I don't need to have any job skills as children.
Well, now, no, that's not, depends how you come in.
Oh, next step. Okay.
Let's just clarify. The Immigration Act has 2 or 3 categories by which you come in the country. One is sponsorship by family. The other is by having to demonstrate a very clear need in the country for your skills. And if you don't have them, as you know right now, I've put a basic embargo on all independent applications.
So that independent
so they can't come in.
If I'm a tradesman from the United Kingdom, there's no way I can get into this country now.
Unless you can prove that there is a job that a Canadian can't fill. And not just from the United Kingdom, from Germany or from India or from Brazil. The fact of the matter is, what we're doing now is protecting the jobs for Canadians, and that's why we've put this particular embargo on.
I've got that clear. There's a total embargo on independent immigrant applications to come to Canada unless your trade is vital to this country.
And unless the employer can't fill it by a Canadian.
All right, but once I am in this country and I've got my 4 sons and daughters with me, is it not a fact that as a matter of right I can bring in 4 fiancés?
As a matter of right.
As a matter of habit, I can bring in my fiancée, correct?
If those sons and daughters want to get married to somebody, they have a right to sponsor.
Right, and they sponsor as a matter of right, not as a matter of trade or qualification. As a matter of right, they can sponsor a fiancé.
That's right, Jack, and the reason for that, and let me point out, is that Parliament, when it went through a very extensive review of the legislation, felt that one of the basic values in this country is the right to have families living together. Not to have to be separated. So that's the basis upon which the right is there.
Mr. Minister,
that's the law that I administer.
I'm talking about the exploding uncounted immigration, and I hate to talk about this, but somebody's got to. Okay, here we have the 4 sons or the 4 daughters who bring in 4 spouses.
Oh, but before we go too far down the track,
take 1 son.
But you used the word exploding.
Exploding, yes.
Let me point out to you that in the last several years, 4 or 5, the family class hasn't varied within 4,000 or 5,000. It's been about 50,000 per year.
51,000 last year.
And 54 the year before and going down, so that there's no explosion. It's a constant pattern about the same level. So I think it would be wrong for you to try to suggest that somehow that there is a growing sort of mushrooming. It's not. It's staying the same. There's the same pattern.
I know, but this is how it works, sir. Okay, we'll take 1 couple with 1 son. Brings in 1 fiancé. The moment that fiancé is in, she can bring in, and you changed the act in 1978 by regulation, she can bring in parents of under 60 and their children.
So once they get married, they have a right then to bring in their parents.
Bring in their parents with more children and more fiancés and more parents under 60.
Yeah, but don't forget at the same time, that legislation in 1978 substantially changed what they call the assisted relative class. and reduced it substantially so that a lot of people previously were coming under sponsorship as assisted relatives. Now it's all under the family class. And again, Jack, the numbers, in fact, haven't changed. So, I mean, if you look at the practical results, you describe these sort of chain effects.
Exploding family chains who come in as a matter of right.
Yes, but the fact is that in total numbers, it hasn't changed. In fact, it's declining, and it's leveling off.
Would the figure of 17 to 1 immigrant shock you? 17 exploding family to 1 immigrant, would that shock you?
In some cases, it doesn't shock. Look, when you're an immigration minister, nothing shocks you anymore. You're beyond being surprised. But what I am much more concerned about is what happens overall. I mean, you're always going to find exceptions. You're going to find people who take advantage of it. But my concern is to ensure that the law is fairly applied and that we don't allow exaggerated abuses so that people in this country will still maintain the basic commitment to a fair Immigration Act. And I think it's possible to say and right to say that our immigration program overall is a fair one, and that while people, you say, scam it or abuse it.
Not me, the Auditor General says so.
Well,
he had access to all your books and figures. He talks about the courier parent racket for a start. And you know about the courier parent racket.
And there is a very severe problem there, and we're looking at it to see how we can deal with it. I'm not saying, Jack, that any piece of legislation shouldn't be subject to scrutiny and review and change. And like any new act, in 1978, we're only, 4 years beyond its application. We've been going through a shaking out period. We've made major changes, tightening up the refugee program and improving it. We're now looking at the enforcement program. So what we've taken is a basic piece of legislation, and we're now trying to massage it into something that will be a good piece of legislation.
Now, I know you don't accept what's Mr. Dye's report, but I want to give you a couple.
No, I didn't say I didn't accept it. I just said that
You think it was hysterical?
No, I just think that Mr. Dye and the Auditor General's department have a certain perspective based upon their training as accountants.
On their finickiness.
I'm saying that you also have to be equally concerned about the human element, the social and economic questions, which they didn't address themselves to.
Well, he did. He's very much concerned that the repercussions of people coming in with no work experience, no knowledge of the language, no training, no jobs, who get lost in the system, who finish up on welfare instead of sponsorship. He said that they can put a severe weight on our social system.
Well, I think in that case, he really doesn't understand or know what he's talking about in that case, because our records show that in many cases, those under family reunification have the same skill, range, and possibility for employment as those coming under the skilled class.
More with the Minister of Employment and Immigration after the break. "10% of all immigrants in this country were legalized by ministerial permits in the last few years, correct?"
Not so much legalized. They were given status in the country. They still have to go through the processing in the country. They still have to go through the normal checks and security examinations.
You seem recently have put down the hammer on the entry of Canadian spouses, haven't you?
On Canadian spouses?
A Canadian with a spouse is pretty tough now to get into the country.
No, there's no difference than the rules before.
All right. Are you now enforcing the fact that a family which has a child with, say, brain damage, the child is inadmissible to the country?
That's always been very clear that people who are applying to come in the country who are inadmissible, and that's primarily because of provincial concerns in terms of the maintenance of costs to their social or health systems. Where the province is prepared to waive that rule, we bring them in, and we have in many cases done that if there's a very compassionate humanitarian reason for doing it.
Now we come to the Eisenbergs, a patently clean Canadian family, a German family, who swear that they were told in Bonn, and I've had the same kind of information in other cases, all you have to do is to get a medical examination, a police record, present yourself at Canada, and you'll be able to apply for immigration later. Now, what about the Eisenbergs? They have an extension until February the 7th. They and their families have spent a total of $50,000 or $60,000 in this country. What's so wrong about adding one more ministerial permit when 10% of all your immigrants come in by ministerial permit? Will you consider that for the Eisenbergs?
Well, the problem in that particular case, Jack, is that this is a family that came in saying that our embassy gave them wrong advice. We checked very thoroughly, and the embassy said they don't even have a record of the Eisenbergs even making any application through the Bonn embassy. So it's his word, I guess, against the people in the embassy. The other side of it is this is somebody who wants to come in to take a job potentially away from a Canadian, and under the laws has no status in the country other than the fact that he and his family came as visitors, and now decide, as many other people would like to decide, that this is a better chance than where they came from. But if I did that, then I would have tens of thousands coming in doing the same thing. And so in this circumstance, we have to say, you know, it's unfortunate. They would probably make very good citizens in the country, but there are certain rules, and we have to try to adhere to those rules.
You see, the point I made about the Eisenberg case, because when they came to me, I said, look, you're deportable, right on the face of it.
Right.
You have no right to be in this country. And then I saw Dye's report, some of which you accept is correct, don't you?
Yes, but the Dye report, I doesn't say that we should be allowing people in who very clearly the rules say aren't eligible.
Of course it doesn't. I'm merely taking the pragmatic viewpoint. There are so many scams, rackets, and 10% by ministerial permit. This is a good-looking family. Why don't you let them in?
But Jack, to use the old cliche, two wrongs don't make a right. And you're not going to correct things by saying, well, let's just open the doors so that, do you know what would happen? I mean, if, let's say on your program this morning, I said, look, I'm going to be very, very lenient. We'll let the Eisenberg stay. It wouldn't take more than 24 hours for the word to get around that all of a sudden there's a new policy made by the Minister of Immigration that if you want to come to Canada as a visitor and then say, gee, I've got a nice family, we want to stay in Canada, our airports would be flooded with people using the same reason, the same excuse, and then you'd be on this program week saying, boy, is Axworthy ever soft-hearted and soft-headed, he's letting all these people in. You can't have it both ways, Jack.
But you see, that's what I said when I saw the Auditor General's report. Axworthy is soft-hearted, soft-headed, and it would seem that headquarters has lost control of the department.
No, because I think what they're pointing out there is that there are people who deliberately go about trying to get around the system. We want to catch them. If we catch them, we'll prosecute them. We'll take them to court when we can find them. The other point...
Well, that reminds me, you've lost 9,000 immigrants who owe you $10 million. You've lost them, according to the...
Well, can I point out something about that figure? And again, you take one report, you have to balance it against other reports. That the repayment ratio on our loans for refugees coming over is higher than the repayment on student loans in this country. And that we have a particular problem because many of the Southeast Asians who came in the refugee program in the last 2 years are still getting themselves established. But if we go by past records, our repayment rate was about 98%, which is, compared to most government programs, pretty high.
Just two very short questions.
Okay.
Are you considering an amnesty under the program? I know you've got Gerald Robinson looking into the matter of illegal immigrants. Are you considering a probationary period of 6 years for illegal immigrants within the foreseeable future?
No.
No.
No. I think that particular recommendation, I've asked Mr. Robinson to look at and to discuss it. But let's make it quite clear. There is no amnesty in the works at the present time.
And you're going to change the procedures at the border so that your immigration officers have a better chance to question and spot the many illegal immigrants now in the country?
Yes.
Oh, what way?
Well, that's what Mr. Robinson is presently looking at, advising me on, and as soon as we get the recommendations, we'll implement them. In fact, be a good program to talk to him in perhaps in a month or two time and find out what he's thinking about.
Love to.
Okay.
I want to find out if he agrees with Dye, because I happen to agree with Dye and you don't. Well, you do concede that there are legitimate criticisms of your department in there.
Sure, and I'm prepared to act on them. My point as a minister is not simply to protect the department. My point is to make for good programs and good legislation, and that's what I intend to do.
One segment of calls to the minister after this break. Where am I going? What am I talking about? To Lloyd Axworthy, Minister of Employment and Immigration, a call from Houston, BC. Go ahead, please.
Oh, good morning.
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 Mr. Axworthy, maybe you can explain to us, we have an EBAP program up here in Houston, then we have that job creation and building a museum. I was hired on for the museum, but because I was 3 weeks short of reapplying for my EUI, I couldn't have the job, so I was let go without even starting work. Why is it the exhaustees are still getting nothing, and people on UI are receiving still and beefing up their checks?
Well, as I explained at the opening of the program, we've just introduced the new NEED program, which is a job creation program specifically for those who've exhausted benefits. And what we would like to see happen is in the case where there is an EBAP program, such as working in Houston, we could put a NEED program beside it so that those who've exhausted benefits would be able to work in conjunction with those who are still collecting benefits. And if you're up there, you should talk to the sponsors and say, get their application in to our employment center. We'd respond to it very quickly because I'm signing the agreement this morning with the BC government to go ahead.
What kind of program were you on, caller?
I'm not on. I'm an exhaustee. They had a job creation for building a museum up here, and the people were hired that were on UIC only, that were collecting.
That was
I
a
was
section.
hired because I have experience in the job.
Yeah, that was
Okay.
Section 38, Jack, and you're right. The only people eligible for that were those who were still on unemployment insurance.
Yep.
But with this new NEED program, that is designed for people who have exhausted, and those two programs can work in conjunction, can work together. And I suggest that, in fact, I'll make sure that my office contacts the people up in Houston to see if they're interested.
Okay, bye. Go ahead, please.
Yes,
Question to the minister.
Mr. Axworthy.
Yes.
Yes, I work with the New Westminster District Labor Council on one of the unemployment action centers,
Yes.
and we deal with many UIC cases every day. And we find a lot of times people's cases are unjustly held up for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Sometimes for as long as 3 months while certain decisions are being made, and this causes great financial hardships. And once we phone there and try to straighten things out, we seem to get the things straightened out within a day or so. Why are certain individuals discriminated against?
Well, there's certainly no intention to discriminate. Sometimes in applications for unemployment insurance, there are circumstances which may not fit the normal or routine application.
Well, let me
That may
ask
have to
a
be
bro-
checked through.
Mr. Minister, let me ask a broad question. Do you feel the UI system is working properly? You laid off a number of people in Vancouver the other day who were extra help in your UIC offices. Are you properly staffed, and what are your delays now in handling claims?
Well, Jack, just to put that in perspective, we have hired over 500 additional workers in the UI offices to deal with the very large increase in claim loads. The 80 people laid off in Vancouver were done so because the claim load has come down in Vancouver, and they didn't want to move to Prince George or other areas where there's still a high claim load.
Right.
And so what we've got to do is use those same places to go where the pressure is most severe.
Are you happy with the performance of your people in the UI?
Yeah, I think they've worked very hard.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, good morning, Jack.
Morning.
Mr. Axworthy came on there this morning and he said that UI premiums went up 30%. Well, I went from $11.50 every pay period to almost $18. So where would I apply to get the difference back for the 30%?
Well, you better go back and check whoever's doing your accountancy, because that's not the range. We went from $1.63 to $2.35, $2.40 at the upper levels, and depends on how much money you make, how much you pay.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mr. Axworthy, your department issues a minimum of 50 work permits in the north to the dredging companies. And there's no training program, no nothing. And these people get all the permits they want.
Which people?
The dredging companies. Dawn Petroleum gets some, Gulf Oil gets some, Imperial Oil gets some.
Are you talking about foreign labor? Are you talking about foreign technicians?
Foreign labor, work permits,
Yeah.
not legal immigrant status, work permits.
Where from?
Most of them are from Holland.
50 a month.
50 jobs that I know of for sure.
Well,
a minimum 50.
Jack, I know.
Season, but there's more than that.
I know about those cases. We only give those permits for people who have skills that we can't attract here in Canada. And let me point out that just again today, we've announced another $14 million going into the province of British Columbia to the community colleges to increase their training facilities, particularly in those areas of high technology, high skill that aren't being offered. So we recognize that there are some jobs that can't be filled by Canadians, and therefore you have to have someone come in and do it, otherwise the project stops. But we are turning that around by putting money into our training system to eliminate that problem.
You know, one of the real tragedies...
We're doing the job up there now. We're doing the job. But nobody will recognize it.
Well, I know you're doing it, but there are some areas where the employer says there are certain skill requirements, particularly because of the kind of dredging equipment that they use.
Which company are we talking about?
Talking about Falker Stabbins getting in there, or he's talking about guys mixing paint. We got guys in Canada that can do that.
Well,
I'm working right on the job. I see it every day.
You're working up in the
I'm
boat.
working right there, and I know what's happening.
Where are you working?
I'm working for Dome Petroleum. I'm working on a dredge in the Beaufort Sea.
And you say that there are Dutchmen there mixing paint.
That's right. There's one guy there supervising paint. We got him people here in Canada. They give Dutch guys legal immigrant status, and then they set their own criteria to bring in whoever they want.
Jack, we'll look into it.
Will you look into that,
Yes,
Mr.
we
Minister?
will. We certainly will.
Thanks very much. Because we're up against it again in BC. The other day, BC Hydro laid off how many apprentices? 80. 80 apprentices, right? And they're told that they can't come back to finish their apprenticeship because they don't anticipate the need for journeymen. These guys are going to lose their skills, and then 3 years down the road we'll be bringing in Brits or Germans or whatever.
Well, in fact, you know, if I can just make a small plug, under the Unemployment Insurance Act, we have a Section 39. We can take those same apprentices. They can go back to school and get the kind of classroom requirements they need, and we'll pay their allowances during that period of time.
They can't finish their time in class, though, can they?
No, but they can accelerate it and combine it so that when the jobs come back, they've already accomplished that period.
Go ahead from where? Westbridge?
Yes. Hello, Jack.
Uh-huh.
Axworthy.
How are you this morning?
First of all, I'd like to say that how much I appreciate the compassionate nature of Canadian immigration. I came as a school teacher in 1967, and I settled here. I'm now a citizen, and I'm married to a Canadian, and we have 6 children, 4 of whom are, one is adopted.
Ma'am, don't give me the full family history, please. Do you have a question for the minister?
And 3 are unaccompanied minors, and I think that was a very, very good program for the immigration, the unaccompanied minor program.
Yes, ma'am. We think it was an excellent program.
Jack, can I make one comment on that?
Yeah.
Because one thing I am looking at, and I hope your own viewers would be in agreement. When I was in Central America, I saw many camps where there were tens of thousands of kids who had lost their parents in the civil wars there. And what we are working on is a small program to help bring some of those children into Canada, to provide them with training, just as a gesture that we still are a privileged country and can provide that kind of support, so that even though in our tough times, I think there's still room for some very strong humanitarian gestures by this country.
I don't think you'll get any quibble from anybody, even on any race or on refugees. But the widespread belief that there are scams does cause resentment.
Well, and I think that that's a point you've made clearly this morning, and it's something that obviously, in order to protect the Immigration Act, we'll have to deal with it.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm from the I'm a Canadian that grew up in the United States from 1960 to 79, and I'm going to be very candid about this question. Why were so many East Indians, Mr. Minister, allowed into Canada starting in the mid-60s? Seeing most people I talk to don't like them very much. My question is, why were they allowed in?
Well, the Immigration Act in Canada doesn't have any quotas or levels for any particular country, that anybody can apply to come, and if they meet the rules and the regulations, then they're allowed in. And those rules are very simple. They can come in sponsored by their family, they can come in because they've got certain skills that the country can't afford, or they come in as refugees. And those are the 3 categories. So there's no country level or country quota.
But they are the group who bring in most family reunification, the Chinese and the East Indians, because they're very closely knit. Well, most Brits, when they come here, want to get away from their family.
Well, there's no question there's a cultural difference.
There is a cultural difference. You made your point, sir. Go ahead from Stuart up on the Alaska frontier. Go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Morning.
Do you hear me okay?
Yes.
2 points, Jack.
Uh-huh.
Immigration first. Canadian consular officials overseas have a bad habit of advising people to come over here and then apply for their landed immigrant status here. They should be better in touch with the minister and be advised over there that they cannot do that, because over here, they come over here and then they're told they have to get the hell back out of the country to apply for the same thing. That's the 1 point. Point 2, employment. I'm afraid the government has the priorities mixed up. They're always coming up with employment programs, new jobs. Why not hang on to the damn jobs that's here now first, and then create new jobs? If the minister would like to explain to me how you can propagate a forestation program in the middle of the winter, it's pretty hard to plant trees right now in January.
Well,
I think maybe you could bring this up as another topic.
Okay. Just finishing that briefly, Mr. Minister.
Well, just on those 2 points, Jack. First, on the employment question, the caller would be interested to know that we are strongly interested in preserving jobs, and that the work sharing program that we introduced just last year has well over 200,000 Canadians preserving their jobs. We've saved about 80 or 90,000 jobs as a result of work sharing.
That was a good program.
It's a good program, and we are deeply concerned about expanding that program. On the immigration question, again, I'm concerned that if in fact they're getting that advice, it's the wrong advice, and I would really be very anxious to know if we are having officials saying that, because then we would get back to them. But the basic rule is that you apply from outside of Canada.
Take it from me, they're getting that advice. People who speak to me generally are telling me the truth on a casual basis. Are you planning to restrict family reunification programs because of the exploding factor?
At this point, there is no intention to change the family reunification clause. What we will do, and are doing now, is looking at the enforcement of it to make sure that it is honored according to the rules and not going around the rules.
To wipe out what Dye and Webster say are massive scams and what you say are minor inconsistencies.
Well, those are your words.
My thanks to the Minister of Immigration, Lloyd Axworthy. Next, keep watching Jack Monroe and Bob Blanchard because Peter King, remember I asked who Peter King was? He's here after the break.
Good.
I could have fallen off my chair the other day when Fred Clark with his shingle mills said to me that he'd put 150 men back to work in his places in the valley. 150 men whose jobs are now down the tube. Here's what happened on the program. You say that nobody will close down if you open up. Is that right?
Of course not. Not the ones that are operating. The ones he's talking about in the New Westminster.
I would suggest that you talk to Mr. King, Mr. Webster.
Who's Mr. King?
He is the owner of Bestwood Shingle Industries, and has talked to his crew and had his crew ready to come down and pick it out the regional office, the Haney office, and the mills that were operating at lesser rates of pay if the union didn't do something about getting the rates back to where they belong.
Bob, you've told me that 10 times.
We sat in a meeting at the Labor Relations Board the other day, and they couldn't get a cord, FIR couldn't get a cord from any of the operators in that room. You put 7 of them in a room together, and you get 7 different opinions.
We're not asking it forever, too. If the market starts coming back, we'll gradually give you back.
Do you deny that Peter King did not come into town and say, if you guys don't cut your rates, then you're being shut down and we're going to run in the valley?
Peter King said what?
To his Bestwood operations in New Westminster, that if they didn't cut their rates, he was going to shut them down and run in the valley.
This, I can't speak, but I don't know what Peter King says. I know that he's upset, but he wasn't upset when you guys come out in 3 or 4 years ago and wildcatted me and got an extra 2 bits a square or whatever it was.
Here is Peter King. Bestwood, what do you call your firm again?
Bestwood Industries.
Your name was taken in considerable vein when I had the Clarks on the other day telling me about the close down of Green Log Sales and Scott Cedar Products. And that was Blanchard of the IWA and Jack Monroe of the IWA saying certain things. For instance, that you had your crew ready to go downtown and pick at the regional offices in the Haney office of the IWA if these mills were allowed to work at lesser rate. Did you say that?
I didn't say that, Jack. No, I didn't. I think the crews were ready to go down and make the IWA live up to its requirements and to its published statement that there would be no rollbacks, knowing that there were rollbacks in the valley. Now, you know, we just didn't say some of the things that Jack Monroe said. We don't deal with our crew in that fashion.
You deal with your crew in a formal fashion as a union crew?
Well, we sit down and talk with them, and we have a dialogue, and we end up coming to certain decisions. That's
what was the key thing he said was the Bestwood operations... oh, yes, it was said, too, that you would close New Westminster and run your mill in the valley. Is that true?
Well, that's not what we said, and that's not what we could do in any event. We have a shake mill in the valley, and we have a shingle mill in New Westminster. One's not a substitute for the other.
And the shake mill is closed down?
That's correct.
Has been closed down since when?
May of 1982.
And the shingle mill is running right now?
That's correct.
And you did not, you certainly didn't threaten the IWA that your men would go and picket them?
We don't threaten anyone, Jack.
Now, what is the situation then? Were you unhappy about the deal that Clark had made informally with his crews, allowing him to operate at the 263 rate, which made them $170 a day? Were you unhappy about that?
Well, we didn't know about it until it had happened, and it didn't only happen at Fred's Mills. It happened at Meeker Cedar and Clayton Cedar. And they told us that it had happened on October the 1st, and we explained that this was at an FIR meeting, and we discussed the problems that they might have with both the union and the employees with grievances. And they informed us that the Haney local had said that they wouldn't do anything about it. They wouldn't process grievances. They wouldn't do anything about it. In the middle of November, when the market had taken a substantial drop, we went to both the Vancouver and New Westminster locals and also our crews and told them that because of the situation, our revenue was down, could be down approximately $40,000 a month, and that if this continued, it was a very serious situation. We might, from economic reasons, have to, at some stage in the game, shut the mills down.
Go on.
Now, what happened at that point was we gave them three options. We said they could either work at the 81 rates and so that we would be competitive and everything would be the same. They could get everybody back to the 82 rates, or the union could sit down with us, and us meaning the whole industry, or the whole shake and shingle industry, and negotiate some additional rate, some different rate. The crews went back to the New Westminster and Vancouver locals. The locals said, you cannot, we will not allow you to take the 81 rates. And the New Westminster local at that point, or the New Westminster crew, our Metro crew, went to the union and said, well, if you're not going to let us do something, you have to stop the situation in Haney. Our crew didn't know what was happening up there, and they were pretty darned upset. The IWA has taken a position of no rollbacks. They've stated it publicly, they've told it to FIR, and it was public knowledge that the Haney local had allowed this to happen, and really the region should have been doing something about it. That would have stopped the whole issue, and they should have done something on October the 2nd.
But that would have closed everybody down.
Well, no, I don't think it would have closed everybody down. I think they would have stood by their principles, and those mills that could run at the 82 rates would have run, and those that couldn't. Now, the problem is that very few of us can run for very long at the 82 rates.
You're running now in your Metro Mill and in New Westminster, you're running at the 82 rates.
That's right. But the big issue is that we face a very serious problem in our industry with non-union mills. Last year in 82, the union mills ran at about 25% of their capacity. Non-union mills ran at 100%, some of them were running 3 shifts. We've had 5 mills go out of business, literally go out of business. They're shut down, they're gone. We have another 5 mills that are shut down. Matter of fact, today there are only 3 union mills that are running, to my knowledge.
How many non-union mills are running?
Oh, well, they're probably 50 or 60 that are running. And they've been running steady all the way along. They're just not affected by this. They can adjust their rates to suit the market, and that's what they're doing. And the other thing is that our fellows who have been working 5, 10, 15, 20 years for our company and other companies, when we can't run any longer and we have to lay them off, they go down the street to an unknown non-union mill and work for 30 and 40% less, while we end up still having to pay the medical benefits of $100 a month for them. We're cutting our own throats. This industry is just going down the tube if we don't sit down and do something about it.
It's even worse than I thought it was.
Well, I'd like really at this particular point, we've been talking through FIR with Bob Blanchard, the regional council, and with various locals since February of 82 to try and find a solution to it. And we really haven't come to a solution at this particular point. And I would think that if they want to get some people back to work, if the IWA is seriously concerned about its membership in this industry, that it will sit down and say, look, we'll come to the table and we'll agree to sit down and talk about these piece rates. Fred Clark is right. For years, all the rates have gone up, is up. The crews were able to hold the companies to ransom with wildcats and various things when the market was good, and the companies responded by negotiating increases. Okay, in 75, we all got together at FIR and said, we're not going to do it anymore. And if you want an increase, you have to come before the Shake and Shingle Council and discuss the increase, because we realized that if one mill gave it, the other mills wouldn't have the opportunity, to do anything about it when their crews come and said, I want the same thing.
Well, I don't think I need Blanchard or Monroe on at the moment at all. You've explained the situation very succinctly to me. Let me go over it a little bit.
Okay.
The union shake and shingle mills, which have operated in the past few years always in a pretty upward market,
up to 75,
are now for the first time feeling the real heat of competition and the loss of your California market. You've operated in a $115 minimum base. You went as high as $303 under the agreement. Up the valley, the Haney local agreed to drop that to $263.
The crews agreed to do it, and the Haney local didn't do anything about it.
Didn't do anything about it. You and New Westminster are stuck with the full 82 rates.
That's correct.
The union, non-union mills are getting all the business. The guys are working for 30 or 40% less, and you're going to be put up against the wall.
Our employees are going to be out of work. I mean, nobody will win in this. We will go broke. The employees will have wages of 30 to 40% less, and the union won't get any membership.
How long can you keep going?
Well, it depends on what happens in the marketplace.
Well,
we're all hoping that something will happen this spring, and but we hoped last spring, and we hoped the spring before, and nothing happened in those years. So
you've cleared the record as far as you and the IWA are concerned. You made no threat. Your crew may have wanted to pick at the office if they didn't clean up the Fraser Valley thing, but your position is formal agreements with the union or with the State Council of FII.
Well, I think that's the only legal way to go. I think, Jack, one of the issues is that our crew threatened to go down to the regional office because they had to drag their local and the IWA screaming into reality. They had to bring them in and say, you've got to live up to your stated principles.
Now, there's one question I can't ask you. Would your crew be willing to work for the modified rates as agreed to by the Fraser Valley shop committees?
Well, we haven't asked them. I don't know what they would respond to that.
Now we know who Peter King is. He's another guy who's got a problem in the marketplace.
Well, Jack, I think really what we need to do is, and I think the IWA has to agree to come and sit down and let's try and resolve this issue. Because they'll lose membership, we'll go broke, and the industry will become non-union. Those are the facts. It's halfway there right now.
My thanks to Peter King. Next, here's a guy who can solve anything and everything. Paul Weiler, former chairman of the Labour Board of British Columbia, professor at Harvard Law School. He can give me an instant solution to this, just like that, after the break. In the studio now is Paul Weiler of Harvard Law School. First, a little bit of background. It's about 10 years since Paul Weiler was brought here by the NDP government at the time the Labour Code was written. And the backroom boys on both sides, employers and management and unions, will tell you that Weiler was in his own way quite a genius. He always left the door open, a little bit Machiavellian. And he was the guy who shaped the BC Labour Code. And I remember one of the most dramatic things he ever did was when he sawed a baby in half at the General Hospital. Because we were all hanging around his office. How was he going to solve this damnable strike at the General Hospital? He solved it perfectly well. He nominated what services must go ahead, and he ordered certain members of certain unions to cross their own picket lines to make sure it didn't degenerate into a dreadfully violent, horrible strike. And the Weiler technique was very successful on that occasion, was it not, Mr. Weiler?
I think it worked that time. It was not the Weiler technique, it was the Labour Code technique.
Well,
the Labour Board technique.
I prefer to call it the Weiler technique, because one of the other insiders said, you know, Weiler took that Labour Code and he would come up with a solution. And if the code didn't fit, he'd have the government amend the code to fit his solution. Is that correct?
We did that a couple of times, but it was, one can personalize the Labour Board, but it was, I had a lot of very good people, a lot of non-lawyers on the board who gave this law professor quite an education in the realities of labor relations in this province.
A lot of good people and a couple of people I never ever liked, but that's beside the point. You do deserve considerable respect for that. I have a little thesis for you to work on in the current recession. Oh, by the way, in Harvard, are you excluded from all reality in your work at Harvard?
We're not caught up in the near depression that seems to be affecting the entire industrial world that they spawned in Washington and that you see the effects of in Vancouver.
I have a theory, Dr. Weiler, must be Dr. Weiler. I have a theory that one of the problems today is that we have a new generation of labor leaders who have been born and bred in affluent, roughly non-striking times, and that they cannot cope with falling prices and falling wages. Do you think this is going to require a totally new approach by unions and labour boards to cope with the dreadfully depressed basic markets in British Columbia?
Well, I really think, and I come and listen to people in Vancouver, and I mean, I think there is a big mistake in thinking this is a problem that's special to British Columbia. This is a worldwide problem, and you can see it in Scotland, and you can see it in New England, and you can see it in places around. What we have is a very serious Well, and your hypothesis is quite right, that people have not yet learned, and I really think it's almost impossible to learn how to deal amicably with a situation of a contracting pie. It's a lot easier to negotiate and reach constructive statesman-like solutions when you got an expanding pie. But when the pie is contracting, as it is for reasons of the current economic philosophy of the government of Washington, it's a terribly difficult problem to handle. And I really think that it is, and we see it in a microcosm, in a sense, in this problem that you've been talking about in the Fraser Valley. To expect a small number of employers and local unions to try to work out a solution to a problem that's presented by these large economic forces is really asking to do something they can't do.
Well, perhaps the answer is in more arbitrariness. I don't mean arbitrations, because arbitrations are unacceptable now to the boss. Is that not so?
To the employers?
To the employer.
Yeah, things have really changed. Back 10 years ago, when we were developing the labor code, the problem that people saw as the problem was labor unrest. And everybody was saying, how do you stop strikes? How do you stop pickets and hot declarations and things like that? Now, the problem that people see is the problem of labor peace. And it's not only in BC. I've talked to, for example, the senior officials in the auto industry and the steel industry in the United States and their unions, and they developed in the 50s and the 60s, the early 70s, very good mechanisms for preventing labor unrest. They're now seeing what the price of that is. And the price of labor peace is the problem of the 80s. I really think it has to be solved through thinking seriously about an incomes policy that doesn't simply single out the public sector employees, but
wage controls.
Incomes controls, not simply wages.
What's the difference between wages and incomes controls?
The difference between incomes and wages is that incomes include professional fees, it includes executive side, it includes dividends, it goes beyond the wages of unionized workers, and that's the problem. Unions don't like the idea of wage controls because their argument is, why single us out? If we're the government employees, for example, why make us pay the price?
More of Paul Weiler's thoughts on income controls. That's everybody.
That's everybody.
Not so good.
That's you and me.
After the break. Not to be so nice to Paul Weiler from Harvard Law School, I'm not impressed by where he works, or even with his new haircut. But what you did, Paul Weiler, really was criminal, not criminal, dreadful in some ways. You created a whole exploding amoeba of labor lawyers, arbitrators, $1,000 a day, costs going on interminably, grievance procedures. They'll bankrupt the country for the lack of lumber exports. Don't you agree there's a grave danger of feather-bedded labor code bureaucracies which go on forever ad nauseam?
Well, certainly lawyers seem to survive through boom times and bad times, and I keep teaching them and churning them out. But I think it's more accurate to say that in the labor code we put in more procedures and measures to reduce the use of lawyers and hearings and court cases and arbitration cases than any other labor statute in North America.
Okay.
So we're talking about a problem of exploding litigation everywhere in labor law, in other aspects of law. We're talking about charters of rights, for example. We're talking about it in BC and Ontario and the United States, but we do have more features of that code, including the fact that most of the people on the board are non-lawyers, which is a unique feature of any statute in North America.
Just as an aside, and I don't want you to pick up it, and ain't that Charter of Rights a total litigious disaster? That's going to drive us all crazy. Common sense is out the window. All the time, Charter of Rights. Now back to the point.
I was not a great defender of the idea of a charter of rights. But that's another subject for another time. But I
was almost totally against it. However, incomes policy. We have a compensation stabilization board in British Columbia. which takes every particular award, looks at it and decides whether or not it will be allowed under the government's 0 to 10% guidelines. Is that crazy?
What's crazy is not the idea of having an incomes policy for reasons that maybe we'll get into. I think that is the way we have to go. What is very undesirable about that is that you're singling out one segment of the workforce to pay the price of wage restraint. And it's the same kind of problem that we see with the IWA. The problem with the IWA in dealing with these problems of concessions is that if they make a concession, they have no way of ensuring that, for example, the people who work in the newspapers that they read or in the television stations that they watch, that those people are making the concessions. So what has to happen, they have no way of ensuring, for example, that professionals, that the lawyers, that the doctors are taking a comparable reduction in their...
Or Safeway.
Or the food workers or the Pacific Press or any of these industries. And they have no way of ensuring also that it's happening in other provinces. Remember, most of the wood that comes out of BC is purchased by people outside this province. And so the benefit of wage restraint in BC will be obtained by people in California, by people in Ontario, but who's restraining the wages of the people in Ontario or California who are selling the products that have to be bought by the people in BC? So it's an awful lot more complicated problem than singling out one group saying they're the scapegoat.
That's why your incomes policy won't work. That's why it won't work.
It has to be a national policy. It has to be one that distributes the burden across the country. And it's
is that not state socialism of the most feather-bedded bureaucratic type?
I don't think it has to be, but it clearly is certain. What you're talking about is restraining the freedom of individual employers, unions, professionals, and others to do their own thing. It's not nice. But the question is whether it's nicer to have 12% unemployment, to have a spiraling recession and depression of the kind that's going on now. You're not making a choice between two nice alternatives. You're having to decide which is the least bad.
What annoys me most of all about the stabilization program is, first of all, Bennett dropped himself into it. He came on here one night and said it's going to be 8 plus or minus 2 to 10 plus or minus 2 to 12 plus productivity bonus. And then, of course, he had to drop that to 6 and 5, 6.5 and 5. But that guarantees, why should civil servants get wage increases at a time of restraint when 200,000 people are applying for unemployment insurance and the shingle mills are going down like 9 pins and the lumber market's gone to hell? The IWA at least has to live with reality, whereas civil servants, they don't live with reality at all, do they?
Well, first of all, there are quite a few. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but I would venture to say that a majority of the members of the IWA are working.
About 65%?
Yeah, 65 or so. So 35%. The problem we have now is that we are trying to reduce inflation through tight money, to make people hurt enough that they reduce their demands on the economy. The price of that is being paid by, overall, some 8 to 10% of the people in the excess rate of unemployment. The rest of the people get the benefit of the reduction in inflation. They're not paying the price. What I'm saying is that everybody should be paying the price, not simply John Fryer and his union members, not simply Jack Monroe and his union members, but all of the people who live in the relatively protected nooks and crannies of this economy.
Stifle the free economy, says Weiler.
The free economy is producing 12% unemployment, and it could get a lot worse as the thing spirals, as some of the smaller developing countries go bankrupt. That affects. I mean, it is a frightening situation that we're looking at.
National action, says Weiler, is necessary to prevent mass unemployment and trouble in the streets down the road.
And I really, one of the great problems...
You don't say that.
I think we do need national action. I said that last summer to a meeting of the Ministers of Labor, that the problem with the restraint program was not that it was too much, is that it was too little. Now, having said that, I think we also have to face the fact that the Canadian economy cannot insulate itself from the effects of what I think are disastrous economic policies in Washington. So I'm not suggesting that a national policy, a national incomes policy, would be a panacea, because the problem has got to be solved in in the negotiations between the President and the Speaker of the House in Washington.
Does anybody remember this man, Paul Weiler? Have a bash after the break. Just let me, one more question. You are seriously advocating a close national examination of an incomes policy which would include profits?
Include profits, it would include dividends, it would include professional fees, it would include executive salaries, it would include the salaries of very highly paid broadcasters.
I knew you were going to take a cheap shot one of these days.
And Harvard law professors, and I think it should be done at the University of British Columbia, and it should be done in other spots.
It's a fearsome spectre, Paul.
What?
Fearsome spectre. I mean, anything the government does, it botches. Look at the national energy policy.
Actually,
one of the great botches of
one
the
of
nation.
the interesting things, there's been a lot of examination now by some very good economists of the anti-inflation program of the mid-'70s. It worked. It did what it set out to do. The problem is that it didn't set out to do enough. I think the real problem with 6 and 5 or with these others is not two problems. First of all, it only covers part of the people. Secondly, it's not ambitious enough. I mean, we should be talking about reducing the rate of income growth to something in line with the rate of increase in productivity.
Paul, when they took
1 or 2%,
when they
not
took
6
the
and 5%.
anti-inflation policy off, union demands exploded.
Not true.
Yes.
No.
25, 25, 25, I remember one.
No, not for 2 years. There are studies that have shown, and there are 5 good studies now have shown that it worked and it did not have a bubble at the end. You're thinking about the Nixon program in the United States.
No, I'm not.
It's a very different one.
I'll give you a classic example of stupidity by the lumber industry in British Columbia, which Knudsen admitted to me. 12% and 13%. They got the 13% last June, and God knows how many people were laid off. Yeah.
That was 2 or 3 years after. Remember, the first settlement in British Columbia after the program was in the construction industry, 8 and 8%.
Okay, I'll take this guy from Houston first. I will. Go ahead from Houston.
You know, Mr. Webster.
Yes.
I had hoped to get to talk to you when you had Mr. Axworthy under. I'm working with the EBAP program.
How soon they forget. How soon they forget.
No, I'm talking to Paul Weiler. Hold on. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, Jack.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask Professor Weiler about his thoughts on an author by the name of Hal Lindsey. He talks about a lot of people, being out of work in a whole global situation.
Have you ever heard of Hal Lindsey?
Never heard of him.
No, never heard of him. Not going to waste time on that with Paul Weiler. Hal Lindsey. He wrote The War of the Worlds or something stupid. Go ahead, please. Hello.
Hello?
Yeah, it's you, sir.
I'd like to comment on what Mr. Weiler is talking about, his income policy. To me, it sounds like the fairest thing I've heard yet, and perhaps the only thing that would work. Maybe it's not the thing that we would want to see implemented in this country, but it might be the thing that would be necessary. Because I believe, just like he's saying, a very small segment of the population of people have really been paying. When the wage controls are put on, it's only hitting a certain class. And if we look back at the time when Nixon was in, their price controls didn't work, and the same thing never worked in Canada because they're not hitting profits.
Okay, boy. What about the profit picture, though?
The studies have shown that during the anti-inflation program in Canada for 3 years, the ratio of income earned by labor to that earned by capital and profits and others improved, so that it did control profits very effectively. We do know how to design the program. It's just that people don't have the will to do it. For some strange reason, people in this country...
Why don't you tell that very loudmouth fellow in Ontario by the name of Dennis McDermott some of the facts of your life?
Well, I have told labor leaders and business people and government people, including ministers of labor across the country, this. I've heard, I know a lot of people who believe it, but there seems to be, for some strange reason, with the exception of a few business leaders, there's a strange alliance between the leaders of big unions and big business who don't want to have this kind of government control of what they're doing.
Go ahead from Powell River.
Hello, Jack.
Yes.
Yeah, it's about time you got on a gentleman that has got some bearing on the society and the problems. This income balance is about time you got that in the air, because that whole thing means what the world means. you've got to balance out the whole damn structure. You can't live like you've been living and fart around with dollars and cents and high business and unions especially where they're
But not unions especially. I mean, I really do resist them. That's one of the problems of trying to get people to accept the idea of an incomes policy, is that they think of it as controls on the wages achieved by unions.
Yeah.
And you make unions into a scapegoat for the problem, which they're not, which they shouldn't be, and you will never get people thinking rationally about a fairer, comprehensive approach to the terrible problem that we face.
The only trouble with the Weiler solution is that you've got 10 provincial governments in this country and a federal government, and getting agreement in this would be about as simple as getting agreement in red light districts across the country from coast to coast.
It would,
wouldn't it?
It's the kind of problem that has to be tackled by the federal government. People don't like to see the federal government taking, I'm sure you'd get the same reaction as the energy. It has to be done in a national economy by the national government.
I've just got time for a couple of very sharp questions from me, myself alone. Is there a place in our society in British Columbia for non-union contractors and non-union labor?
Yes.
Oh, there is?
There's no problem.
Is it ludicrous?
Over, I think, about 50 to 55% of the workforce in this province is non-union.
Is it ludicrous for the big organized unions, who, by the way, are in disarray? BCYT doesn't speak to BC Fed, which doesn't speak to KMAW, which doesn't speak to the Teamsters. They're fragmented now, as you know. Is there room in big media project town sites for non-union labor to work, if not affiliated with, but to work? And is it fair that non-union firms and non-union labor should get some of the work in government mega projects?
Well,
yes or no?
My judgment that I made, and remember the Hardy Boys case in days gone by, is that we should look at a construction site, a single integrated construction site, in the same way as we look at the Harmac mill of Macmillan Blodell, a single integrated production site. You don't have, that's right, you don't have people going in and saying we're non-union and we're going to work in Harmac. I don't see why you should have people who are non-union going in to work on a site, a single site where the vast majority of people are union. Majority rule is the principle that should be followed. I don't know.
My thanks to Paul Weiler. After the break. Paul Weiler's in town for the Pacific Institute Law and Public Policy. The Labor Code in the 80s cost you $275 to go. You had them for nothing this morning. Tomorrow, Webster's walkabout at the Maples, which is the YDC down at Wellington, at 9 a.m. precisely. Immigration rackets on Czech TV at midnight precisely. Walkabout at the Maples tomorrow with Webster at 9 a.m. precisely.